Picture a man in a travelling coach on a summer evening. A proud man, a man who has been a duke his whole life and has never once had to wait for a door to open, leaning out of the window as the horses slow before the great iron gates of the estate he was born to, and going very still. He has been away for years. He has come back, in the end, because he had nowhere else to go, though he would not have put it that way even to himself. In his own telling, he has come back to reclaim what is his, to resume the life he set down for a while, to walk up the drive of Hartwell Hall as its master. But the gates are rum. He stares at them in the low gold light, and cannot at first understand why. And then he understands, and the understanding goes through him like cold water, because the tall iron arch above the gates, where the name Hartwell had stood in gilded letters for 200 years, the name that was his, the name he had believed was the one thing in all the world that could never be taken from him, is gone. The old letters have been struck clean away. In their place, wrought fresh and bright, stands a different name entirely. The name of a house he has never heard of, a house that did not exist when he left, and beneath it, worked into the iron in smaller letters, a single line he will read over and over on the long, humiliating walk that follows, built to last, unlike some. A gatekeeper comes out, a young man in good plain livery who does not know the Duke's face, because the Duke's face means nothing here anymore, and asks him his business, and the once master of Hartwell Hall opens his mouth to say his own name, and finds, for the first time in his life, that it will not get him through the gate. If you have ever been so sure of your worth that you thought a single person could not possibly matter, if you have ever left someone behind, believing they would keep your place warm until you deigned to return, then you already know why the Duke of Hartwell stood at his own gates in the fading light and could not get in. And you already know that the plain, quiet, overlooked woman he left behind has not spent these years waiting for him at all. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and if you believe a woman written off as plain and dull can quietly unmake a proud man and strike his very name from the gates he was born behind, then subscribe and stay with me, because the Duke of Hartwell is about to learn, letter by struck-out letter, exactly what he threw away. But to understand the name on the gates and the woman who put it there, we have to go back to the beginning. To a marriage that everyone agreed was sensible and no one, least of all the Duke, ever bothered to make into anything more. Her name was Rowena, and she had not been born to the aristocracy. She had been born to trade. The only child of a man who had built one of the great merchant houses of the age out of nothing but nerve and arithmetic. A man whose warehouses lined the docks, and whose ships crossed every sea, and whose money the old families of England were far too proud to be seen earning, and far too poor to do without. When he died, he left his daughter a fortune vast enough to buy anything except the one thing he had wanted for her, which was to belong. And so, as such man had always done, he arranged with his last strength to purchase her a place among the great by marrying her into it. The place came attached to Frederick, Duke of Hartwell, whose lineage went back to the Conquest, and whose accounts had not balanced since his grandfather's day. It was, the lawyers said, and the world said, an excellent match. Her money would save his estate. His name would raise her at last above the dock she came from. Rowena was 22, and she was not beautiful, or not in the way the age prized. being sensible-faced and steady-eyed and inclined to say true things plainly, and she knew the marriage was a transaction. But she was young enough to believe that transactions between decent people could ripen, in time, into something warmer, and she went to Hartwell Hall determined to be a good wife to a man she barely knew. She learned over the first year and the next that Frederick did not want a good wife. He wanted the money, which he took, and the freedom the money bought, which she enjoyed. And he wanted, when he thought of her at all, a wife who would be decorative and silent and grateful, and Verona was none of these things, being plain and forthright and, worst of all in his eyes, cleverer than he was. He discovered her cleverness early, and never forgave it. She had made at a dinner in the first months of the marriage a quiet observation about the mismanagement of the estate's timber, a correct observation as it happened, and Frederick had gone cold and pink at once, and had said with a little laugh for the benefit of his guests that he had married a wife and not a bailiff, and that she would oblige him by leaving the running of Hartwell to men who understood it. And Verona, who had grown up at her father's elbow learning how a great enterprise is truly run, had folded her hands and said nothing more, that night or for years after, because she had learned the shape of her cage, which was this, that she might do anything at all for Hartwell, so long as no one, above all her husband, ever saw her do it. So she did everything, unseen. She found the estate's accounts in the chaos that careless aristocratic estates always fall into, and she set them right, quietly, working at night, teaching herself the whole vast machinery of the place the way her father had taught her to read a manifest. She caught the small thefts that bleed every unwatched estate. She renegotiated the leases, drained the sour fields, mended the tenants' cottages, and made Hartwell, for the first time in 3 generations, prosperous. And she let her husband believe, because he wished to believe it, that the estate simply ran itself, that prosperity was the natural birthright of a Hartwell, and required no one's effort, least of all a merchant's plain daughter. She was the invisible engine of a great house, and her reward was to be overlooked in it. There was a loneliness in those years that she never spoke of, because there was no one to speak of it to. It was not the clean loneliness of solitude which can be borne and even enjoyed, but the crowded loneliness of being surrounded and unseen, of sitting at a full table and being spoken past, of pouring one's whole mind into a house every single day and receiving in return not gratitude, which she did not require, but not even acknowledgment, which every soul alive requires. She grew expert at reading her husband's moods so that the household might run smoothly around them, and did never notice the reading, only the smoothness, and took the smoothness for the natural order of things. She learned the name of every tenant's child, and the state of every tenant's roof, and rode out in all weathers to see to them. And the tenants came, slowly, to regard her with a quiet loyalty that would matter enormously in the end, and that mattered, even then, more than anything her husband ever gave her. She sat late over the account books with a single candle, finding and stopping the small, steady hemorrhages of a great estate, and in the morning Frederick would remark, if he remarked at all, that Hartwell seemed to run itself these days, which was the nearest he ever came to praise, and which stung worse than silence. She refused to let it sour her, or she tried to, because bitterness is a poison that harms chiefly the vessel that holds it, and she had watched it hollow other neglected wives into brittle, complaining women, and she was determined not to become one. So she poured herself instead into competence, into the private satisfaction of a thing done well for its own sake, and told herself it was enough. And it was not enough, but it was a way to live. And without her ever intending it, those unthanked years were building in her the two things that would prove more durable than any coronet, which were the ability to run anything at all, and the devotion of every soul who had ever worked beneath her. For competence, unlike beauty, does not fade, and loyalty earned in small kindnesses does not call. And the plain woman whom no one troubled to watch was quietly assembling, in the dark, the exact strength she would need in the light. She might have gone on so all her life, had Frederick been content merely to overlook her. But a man who has never valued anything will, in the end, throw away the most valuable thing he has, simply to prove that he can afford to. And the woman who tempted him to it arrived one spring like a change in the weather, and her name was Lady Sable Verrick. Sable was everything Rona was not, and everything the age adored, dazzling and quick and beautiful, in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. And she wanted, beneath all her charm, one thing only, which was to be the Duchess of Hartwell, to have the name and the coronet and the great old house, and she set about getting them with the patience of a woman who has done this before. She did not love Frederick. Runa saw that at once, having been raised among people who could tell a genuine offer from a swindle, and she watched Sable flatter her husband's vanity, whisper to him that he was wasted on a dull provincial wife, tell him the whole county pitied a man of his blood saddled with a plain merchant's daughter, and she watched Frederick, who had never in his life been asked to deserve anything, decide that he was owed the brighter, newer, lovelier thing, and simply reach for it. It came to its head, as these things do without shame, on a grey autumn morning. Frederick came to Rowena in the very room where she sat over the accounts that kept him rich, with Sable waiting in the hall, and he told her he was leaving. He would take Lady Verrick abroad, and then to the family's warmer estate in the south, and live as a duke should live, and Rowena might stay on at Hartwell Hall, in the older wing, quietly, out of the way, until she came to see reason. "I am not turning you out," he said, as though it were generosity. "You may keep your rooms. You have nowhere better to go after all, no family of consequence, no name of your own, nothing but money. And money's a common thing. But understand me, Rowena, whatever you keep, you do not keep the name. The name is mine. It will always be mine. You are a Hartwell only by my sufferance, and my sufferance is the one thing I am taking with me." And Rowena, who had every right to weep, did not weep. She looked at the man she had married and at the woman in the hall, and she felt, rising in her beneath the shock, something she had not felt in all her years in that cold house, which was not grief, but a strange, clean lightness. Because a cage is only a cage while you believe you cannot leave it, and Frederick had just walked out of theirs and left the door swinging and told her to go on sitting inside. She would not sit. She examined the strange likeness suspiciously, as she examined everything, for a woman who has just been abandoned is expected to feel ruin. And Rowena had spent 11 years doing what was expected. But beneath the numbness she dutifully performed even in the empty room, the lightness held, and it said clearly and steadily one word: free. For 11 years she had been the unpaid, unthanked steward of a man who forgot her, and a house that despised her, her every gift bent to the service of people who would not so much as learn to value her. And now that man had removed himself. He had taken his contempt and his mistress and his sufferance and gone, and left behind a woman of 33 in the full possession of her powers, no longer required to fold her opinions away, no longer obliged to make herself small, answerable at last to no one on earth. And she would never, she promised herself in that grey morning room, beg, I understand, was all she said. And Frederick, disappointed by her calm as a cruel man is always disappointed when his cruelty fails to land, took his mistress and his sufferance and went, and the great door of Hartwell Hall closed behind him, and the silence he left was the most spacious thing Rowena had ever heard. She sat for a long while. Then she rang for the housekeeper. Mrs. Egerton had kept Hartwell for 30 years, and had been treated by the Duke as a thing that occasionally spoke, and by the Duchess as a person. She had not forgotten the difference. When Rowena told her plainly what had happened, the old woman did not gasp or weep. She said only, "Then we had best learn exactly what is left, and exactly what is taken, Your Grace. For a body can't plan a campaign without knowing her own stores." And she went to a locked drawer in her room and drew out a bundle of papers tied in kitchen string, papers she had been told over the years to burn and had quietly kept. "A house shows you what it is," she said, "by what it wants destroyed. I have kept everything they wanted gone. Those papers were the first thread of the whole tapestry Rowena would spend the coming years weaving, and the first thing they showed her was the true shape of her position, which was very different from the one Frederick believed he had left her in. He thought he had left her a plain wife, with nothing but money in a wing of a house that was wholly his. He was wrong on nearly every count, and most wrong of all about the name and the land beneath it, though it would take Rowena a long time, and a great deal of patience to make him understand how wrong. For here was the thing Frederick had never troubled to learn, being too grand to read the very settlements that governed his life. When Rowena's father had bought this marriage, he had not been a fool, and he had not trusted the aristocracy an inch, and he had written the settlement accordingly. The great infusion of merchant money that had saved Hartwell from ruin had not been a gift. It had been secured quietly, cleverly, against the estate itself, held in trust under Rowena's own name, so that in the eyes of the law the ground the great house stood on was not entirely the Duke's to do with as he pleased. Frederick had spent that money years ago and forgotten where it came from, the way he forgot everything inconvenient, and he had never once imagined that the plain wife he was leaving behind held, in her father's careful papers, a claim on the very land under his family's ancient gates. Rowena had known it in a dim way for years. Now, sitting in the emptied house with the deeds spread before her, she began for the first time to think about what it might mean. She read the settlement that night by candlelight the way her father had taught her to read a contract, which is to say slowly, and twice, and with a pencil, marking every clause that carried weight, and every clause that merely pretended to. And as she read, the shape of the thing rose off the page like a tide coming in, and she understood that her father dying had done for her the one thing a merchant can do that lasts longer than money, which is to write a clever paper. He had not trusted Frederick. He had not trusted any of them. He had watched the great families take trade money for generations and give nothing but contempt in return, and he had made certain in his daughter's marriage that if the contempt ever curdled into abandonment, his girl would not be left with empty hands. The land was pledged to the debt. The debt was hers. It was dormant, and it was complicated, and it would take years and lawyers to wake it and enforce it, but it was real, and it was a foundation, and Rowena, who had spent 11 years building on ground that belonged to a man who despised her, understood that she had, at last, a small square of ground that was her own to build upon. She sat with that understanding a long time, turning it over, testing it for flaws the way she tested everything, and she found that it held. She thought of her father then more clearly than she had in years, and of something he had said to her when she was a girl, watching him claw his way back from a season that had nearly sunk his fleet. The men who ruin you, he had told her, are rarely as dangerous as the belief they plant in you that you cannot survive their leaving. Kill the belief, and the man loses all his power in an instant, for his only real weapon was ever your certainty that you needed him. Frederick had spent his last morning in that house telling her over and over that she was nothing without him, that she had nowhere to go, that the name was his and the sufferance was his and she was nothing. He had been so busy planting the belief that he had never noticed she was not taking it up. And now he was gone, and the belief had gone with him. And what remained was a plain, clever, patient woman, a house she knew better than any living soul, and a clever paper her father had written against exactly this day. It began, as her father's fortune had begun, with a ledger and a great deal of patience. Rowena did not announce a plan, because she did not yet have one. She had only a certainty, hard and bright as iron, that she would build a life and a claim that Frederick could never walk back into, and the discipline to do it one careful, lawful step at a time. She wrote to the sharpest lawyers in London, her father's man, and set them to studying every line of the settlement. She wrote to her father's old associates in trade, men who remembered the father and were startled and then delighted to hear from the daughter, and found that her name, in the counting houses where names are made rather than inherited, opened doors her husband's never could. And she did to the wider world exactly what she had spent 11 silent years doing to Hartwell, which was to find what was failing and mend it, only now the mending was hers. She revived a dormant shipping interest her father had left her. She took a half share in a struggling ironworks and, understanding it within a month, made it thrive. Coal, cloth, iron and freight, the grubby leavings of trade that Frederick despised, she gathered into a single connected enterprise and grew it season upon season. Not by any single stroke of genius, but by the patient compounding of 1,000 sound decisions made by a woman who had at last been given something worthy of her whole mind. She was fair to those who worked for her, ruthlessly fair, because she knew as a merchant knows that a well-used workforce is a productive one, and the best hands in the north came to work for the plain Duchess who paid on time and kept her word, and within a few years she was one of the wealthiest people in the county in her own right, richer by far than the husband who had told her that money was a common thing. The work of those years was the hardest and the happiest of her life, and it passed for her not slowly as her marriage years had passed, but with the swift, satisfying velocity of a life at last aimed at something. She rose before her clerks and went to bed after them. She learned each of her trades from the ground up, not from books, but from the man and woman who did the work, standing at their shoulders on the wharf and the ironworks floor, and asking questions until she understood every stage. And the working people who had braced for a fine lady to visit once and vanish found instead a mistress who could read a furnace or a bill of lading better than their own foreman. She met her payrolls herself, on time to the penny, which no rival house reliably did, and she heard grievances in person and settled them fairly, and once she dismissed a manager who had cheated his man and raised in his place a quiet older clerk who had been passed over for 20 years for no reason but that he was thought dull. And that small act of plain justice was talked of the length of the county, and drew to her the best hands for 50 miles, for word travels faster among working people than among lords about who keeps faith and who does not. She reinvested nearly everything, living plainly in the mended wing of a house she was slowly making glorious, ploughing every profit back into another ship, another furnace, another mended cottage, until the whole thing became a single connected engine that no misfortune could easily stop. And here is the part Frederick, had he been able to grasp it, would have found least bearable of all, which is that she did not do it to spite him. She barely thought of him. He had made himself irrelevant the day he walked out, and the deepest wound she ever dealt him was simply the fact of her flourishing without a backward glance. It was in the cause of the great work of restoring Hartwell itself, for she meant to restore it, that she met the man who would become the better half of her story. The hall under Frederick's long neglect and Croft's quiet theft had been rotting from the roof down. And Rowena, once the settlement lawyers confirmed what her father's papers gave her the right to do, resolved to save the house even as she unmade the man, and she hired for the work the finest master mason and builder in 3 counties, a plain-spoken, careless, brilliant man named Daniel Marsh. She first met him not in a drawing-room but on the scaffolding against the crumbling east front, both of them looking up at the same failing cornice, and he spoke to her as a colleague, argued a point of stonework with her, conceded another when she was right, and never once, in all that dusty afternoon, treated her as anything but a person whose judgment he respected. She did not know, that first year, that Daniel Marsh was more than a master mason. She did not know that he was the grandson of a baron who had turned his back on an idle inheritance to learn the honest trade of building from the stone up, and who kept his birth a close secret precisely so that he might, once in his life, be valued for what his hands could make, rather than for the title waiting on him. She knew only that he was the first man in a dozen years who asked her what she thought and meant it, and that when she stood beside him watching a wall go true and plumb, she felt a steadiness she had never felt in all her cold years as a duchess. There was an afternoon she would remember the rest of her life, though nothing happened in it that a passer-by would have called remarkable. They had been standing over the plans for the east front, disagreeing about whether the old foundation could carry the weight of the restored wing, or whether it must be dug out and laid fresh, and she had argued her case, a good one, drawn from years of watching that particular corner of the house settle and crack, and Daniel had set down his rule and looked at her, truly looked at her, and said, "You are right, and I was wrong, and I am glad you told me so." No man had said those words to her since her father died. Frederick had never in his life said them to anyone, and Rowena, who had grown so used to being unheard that she had half forgotten what being heard even felt like, found that the plain experience of it, of having her judgment weighed by a man whose own judgment she respected and found sound, undid something in her that no cruelty ever had. They worked together the better part of 2 years before either spoke a word that was not about the work, and Rowena treasured those years, because in them she was known, slowly and wholly, for exactly what she was. Daniel did not admire her for beauty, which he scarcely seemed to notice, nor for rank, which he did not know, nor for the fortune she was building, which appeared to interest him not at all. He admired her for the way her mind worked, for the cool speed with which she read a plan, or a ledger, or a difficult man, and he told her so plainly the way one craftsman praises another, and it was more intoxicating than any flattery of her face, because it was earned. There came an evening, late, the two of them bent over a drawing by lamplight, when their hands had brushed reaching for the same corner of the paper, and both had gone still, and neither had drawn back. And in that stillness Rowena had understood with a clarity that frightened her that she could love this man, and that he could love her, and that it was the most dangerous thing in the world, because she was still another man's wife-in-law if in nothing else, and she had built her whole new standing on being a woman whose word was her bond, and whose name was beyond reproach, and she could not risk that even for this. So she had drawn her hand back, gently, and said something about the drawing, and Daniel, who was a man of honour, and had understood her perfectly, had let her, and had never once in the years that followed pressed her, or presumed, or made her hard road harder. He simply stayed. He stayed and worked beside her, and was her friend and her equal, and the one soul before whom she could be entirely herself. And he waited, without ever once saying he was waiting, and the plain fact that he would wait, that he could want her without demanding her, told her more about the man than any speech could have. But that is the warmth of the tale, and there was cold and careful work to finish first. For as the settlement lawyers dug and Mrs. Egerton's kept letters gave up their secrets, and a nervous, honest bank clerk named Alder came forward with private duplicates of ledgers that did not match the official ones, Rowena assembled the full and ugly truth of Hartwell's ruin, and it was larger and colder than she had guessed. Frederick had not merely a mistress, but a household, and the household was run by men he'd never watched, chief among them the steward Croft and a solicitor named Vane. And the two of them had understood, as such men always do, that a careless duke is a fortune waiting to be quietly carved up. They had been bleeding Hartwell for years, forging leases, skimming rents, inflating accounts, and when Sable came into the story they had recognized her at once for the useful thing she was, a lovely and expensive distraction to keep the Duke's eyes turned away while they emptied his coffers, and they had, in their way, helped to steer her toward him. So the affair that Frederick believed was his own grand passion had been, at least in part, a toil held by his own servants, and while he burned so pleasantly in it, they had looted him almost to the bone. And the estate itself, mortgaged and remortgaged by Vane's forgeries in Frederick's careless name, had been sliding toward a creditor's hammer for years without its master ever noticing. This was the opening Rowena had been building toward, though she had not known its exact shape until the papers gave it to her. For the debts secured against Hartwell were real, and mounting, and the estate would, before long, be sold out from under the absent Duke to satisfy them, sold to whatever stranger could meet the price. And Rowena by then was no stranger, and could very much meet the price. She did not seize the house in anger. She did it in law, cleanly, completely, the way her father would have approved. When the debts came due and the estate went quietly to sale, it was Rowena who bought it, through her lawyers, paying off every honest creditor to the penny and buying out every forged claim, so that when the dust of the transaction settled the ground on which Hartwell Hall stood, the ancient seat of the Dukes of Hartwell, belonged outright and beyond challenge not to the Duke at all, but to his plain, discarded, merchant's daughter-wife. She owned the house, she owned the land, she owned the very gates, and she had done it all without a single raised voice, with nothing but patience and ledgers and the quiet certainty that a name is only as strong as the accounts beneath it. She did not do it alone, and she was the first to say so. Mrs. Egerton's kept letters had given her the first thread, the proof that Croft and Vane and Sable were not three separate misfortunes, but one connected scheme, and had let her see, laid out in the villain's own careless hands, exactly how the thing had been run. Young Alder, the bank clerk, honest and frightened and long overlooked at his little branch, had come to her with a year of private copies he had kept out of nothing but an instinct for tidiness, ledgers that did not match the ledgers they were meant to match, and those plain sums had turned misses. Egerton's letters from gossip into evidence, and shown Rona precisely where every stolen pound had gone, and precisely whose hand had sent it, and it was never Frederick's. And the tenants she had spent 11 silent years treating as people rather than rent, came forward one after another with the forged leases Croft had made them sign, and the true old ones some of them had kept hidden in the thatch, and their plain testimony, when the time came, would be worth more than any lawyer's cleverness, because there is nothing a court believes so readily as an honest working man who has been cheated by a clever one. She was not merely buying a house. She was assembling, brick by brick and witness by witness, the whole unanswerable case, so that when Hartwell passed to her it would pass cleanly, lawfully beyond challenge, bought with earned money, and defended by an army of the overlooked. And no clever solicitor and no proud duke would ever be able to say that she had taken by trickery what she had in fact taken by patience and by right. There was one ally in this she had not expected, and it was the one that hurt Frederick most in the end. For the old Dowager Duchess, Frederick's own mother, a formidable and clear-eyed woman who had watched her son's folly with a cold and grown shame, came at last to Rowena's side, not out of affection at first, but out of something older and harder, which was loyalty to the family name itself. "My son," she told Rowena, in the one plain conversation that settled everything between them, "has confused himself with the name he carries. He believes that because he is called Hartwell, he is Hartwell, that the name is his to disgrace as he pleases and will shine on regardless. He is wrong. A name is not a possession. It is a debt, owed to everyone who bore it before you and everyone who will bear it after, and my son has defaulted on that debt as surely as he defaulted on his mortgages. You have saved this house. You have saved the tenants and the land and everything the name was ever supposed to mean. If the name is to survive at all, it will survive because of what you built, not because of what he was called. Do with the gates what you think right. I will stand behind you, for the sake of what Hartwell was meant to be." And so, when the great restoration was finished, when the roof was sound and the fields were rich and the tenants secure and the whole estate stood prouder than it had in a century, Rowena did the thing that would, in time, bring a proud man's coach to a halt in the summer dusk. She had the old iron gates taken down and recut. The tarnished, gilded Hartwell, the name Frederick had told her was his and his forever, the one thing he had been so certain she could never touch, was struck clean out of the metal, and in its place Daniel Marsh and his masons wrought the name of the house Rowena had built, the enterprise and the estate and the whole thriving world that stood now on ground she had bought with her own earned money, and beneath it, at her own dry instruction, the single line that would grate the Duke on the evening he came crawling home, built to last. Unlike some. It was not done in spite. That is the thing to understand. She did not strike out his name to wound him. She scarcely thought of him by then. She struck it out because it was, quite simply, no longer true. He was not the master of Hartwell. She was. And a woman who has spent her life among ledgers does not leave a false entry standing on the books merely to spare a proud man's feelings. The gates now told the truth, and the truth was her name. She had thought a great deal, before she gave the order, about whether to do it at all, for she was not a woman given to grand gestures, and the striking of a name from an arch of iron was as grand a gesture as the county had seen in a generation. But she had come to see that it was not a gesture. It was a correction. For 200 years those gates had announced to every traveller on the road who owned the land behind them, and for 200 years they had told the truth, and now they told a lie, because the man whose name they bore owned nothing behind them at all, had drunk and gained and neglected it all away, and let his own servants carry off the rest. And the plain merchant's daughter he had discarded owned every stone and every acre and every blade of grass. To leave his name up would have been to leave a false entry standing in the most public ledger in the county, and Rowena did not leave false entries standing. So she watched, on a bright cold morning, as Daniel's masons brought down the old iron and set to work, and she felt no vengeance in it, only the deep, quiet, almost bookkeeping satisfaction of a wrong figure at last corrected. The line beneath, built to last, unlike some, she had added almost as an afterthought a single dry allowance of feeling in a decision that was otherwise pure arithmetic, and Daniel, cutting it into the metal, had laughed once, shortly, and said it was the truest thing he had ever been asked to carve. The years, meanwhile, had not been kind to Frederick, and he had earned every unkindness. Sable had wanted to be Duchess of Hartwell, and Frederick could never make her one, because Rowena held the title still and, advised by her lawyers, simply declined to provide grounds for a divorce, and so Sable found herself, year upon year, not a duchess, but a duke's aging mistress, which is a far poorer and less certain thing, and her affection, which had never been affection but only appetite, curdled as the coronet failed to come. And when Croft and Vane had at last bled Frederick dry, when the southern estate was mortgaged to its chimneys, and the creditors closed in, and the money simply stopped, Sable did the only thing a woman of her philosophy could do, which was to leave, decamping to a spa town with what jewels she could carry, and a wealthier prospect already in her sights, gone before the worst of it broke. And Frederick, who had abandoned a faithful wife for her, found himself abandoned in turn, ruined. friendless, and at last driven by pure necessity to do the very thing he had sworn his plain wife would do. He came home to beg. He did not know on the long road north that there was no home to come to. In his mind, Hartwell Hall still stood as he had left it, his by right, his plain wife no doubt keeping it dusted against his return, and he told himself he was going back to reclaim what was his and, if it came to it, to graciously permit Rowena the honour of once more sharing his name and his roof, since a wife's fortune was after all a husband's to command. He had understood nothing. He had never understood anything. And so his coach came up the familiar road in the summer evening, and slowed before the great iron gates, and he leaned out to look upon his ancestral home, and his own name was gone from the arch, struck out, replaced, and a gatekeeper who did not know his face came out to ask his business, and the Duke of Hartwell could not get through his own gates. He gave his name. The young gatekeeper, polite and unimpressed, said he was sorry, but the estate belonged to the mistress of the house, and he had no instruction to admit any Duke of Hartwell, and would the gentleman care to leave his card? It was Mrs. Egerton, grey now and straight as a post, who came down the drive at last and looked at the ruined man at the gate, with no cruelty and no warmth, only a long, level 30 years' assessment, and said that she would ask her Grace whether an audience might be granted, and left him standing in the road while she went back up the drive to a house that had been his and was not, and he waited, as years before he had told her he would never wait, and read and reread the words worked into the iron above him, built to last, unlike some. Rowena did see him, in the end, not because she owed him anything, for she owed him precisely nothing, but because she had learned from her father that an account left open festers, and she preferred to close hers cleanly. She received him not in any room where old feeling might be imagined, but in the great estate office from which she ran her enterprises, seated behind a broad desk stacked with the ledgers of a business that spanned the north, with a clerk at a side table, and Mrs. Egerton by the door, and Frederick, walking into that room, felt the truth of his position close over him like cold water for the second time that day. He had imagined this reunion, and the long road north, and in every version of it she had been waiting, softened by the years, grateful for his return, the plain, patient wife restored at last to the great husband she must surely have gone on loving. It had not once occurred to him, in all those imaginings, that she might not have thought of him at all. But the office told him otherwise before a word was spoken. It was a room built for work, not for feeling, every surface stacked with the ledgers of a great enterprise, and the woman behind the desk was not a wife awaiting her lord, but a person of consequence granting a hearing to a petitioner. And Frederick understood, standing there in his travel-worn coat, that he had become the petitioner, and that everything in the arrangement of that room had been chosen, quietly and deliberately, to make certain he understood it. He felt the old speeches die in his throat. He looked at her, prosperous and calm and entirely unafraid of him, the mistress of the house he was born in, and the last of his illusions fell away, and what was left was a ruined man in a room he did not own, about to ask for a mercy she had never once shown. "Rowena," he said, "I have nothing. I was wrong, I see it now, I was wrong in all of it. The house is yours, they tell me. All of it is yours, and you are my wife still, and I am asking you, I am begging you, take me back. Let me come home." And Rowena looked at him a long moment. The man who had told her the name was his and hers only by his sufferance, standing in a house she owned, begging to be let into it, and there was no triumph in her face, because she had passed years ago beyond triumph into something quieter and more final. "You told me," she said without heat, "that whatever I kept, I would not keep the name, that it was yours and always would be, and that I was a Hartwell only by your sufferance. Do you remember? You were so certain the name was the one thing I could never touch that you built your whole cruelty upon it. But a name, Frederick, is not a possession. Your own mother taught me that, though she had to teach it to me, because she could never teach it to you. A name is only worth what its bearer builds, and you built nothing, and let others tear down everything, and so the name meant nothing, and I struck it out not to wound you, but because it was no longer true. The house was built to last. You were not. That is all the line means." She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. "I will not take you back. Hear me clearly, for this is the last time I will say it, and understand that it is not revenge and it is not cruelty. I forgave you a long time ago, because carrying anger is a weight and I had a house to build and no use for weights. But forgiveness is not return. I can wish you no harm, and still never again set my life upon a man who told me, with a smile, exactly what my worth was to him. You may not come home. You have no home. You struck it from yourself, letter by letter, long before I ever touched the gates. I only took down the letters after they had already stopped being true. The name did not leave the iron the day my masons came. It left it the morning you walked out that door and told me it was worth more than the wife who had kept it standing. All I did was make the gates honest again. What she did for him, in the end, was measured, the mercy of a woman grown far too large for spite. She would not restore him, and she would not enrich him, for that would only feed the men who had fed on him. But she settled through her lawyers a small strict annuity, enough that a duke need not beg in the streets his rank forbade him, paid quarterly, administered by her own people, so that no croft or vein could ever touch it, contingent on his conduct and his silence. It was not generosity. It was the tidiness of a merchant closing a bad account at a small fixed loss, rather than let it trouble her books forever. And it was, though Frederick never had the wit to see it, the final and completest proof of the reversal. For he lived out his years on the charity of the wife he had called common, a duke pensioned by a merchant's daughter, and every quarter when the payment came he was reminded, whether he willed it or not, of exactly what he had thrown away, and exactly whose name now stood upon the gates. Justice came for the others too, measured by the weight of each guilt. Rowena, once Frederick's ruin had laid the machinery bare, put the whole force of her lawyers and her spotless name behind the prosecution of Croft and Vane. Not for her own sake, for she had lost nothing to them, but for the tenants and creditors they had cheated, and the two men who had bled a duchy for a decade were tried on the plain evidence of their own forged papers, convicted, stripped of everything, and transported beyond the sea, and the county was glad to see them go. And Sable, whom the law could not touch, was punished by the only currency she had ever valued, for the tale of her long, fruitless siege of a coronate followed her everywhere, and the doors that had opened to her beauty closed against her reputation, and she drifted from spa town to spa town, growing harder and less lovely each season, a duke's cast-off mistress and never a duchess, exiled at last not by any judge, but by the very logic she had lived by, which prizes a person only for the position they can seize, and leaves nothing at all for the one who seizes and misses. As for Rowena, her story did not end at the gates, because it had never truly been about Frederick at all. He was only the door she was shoved through. On the far side of it she had built a life, and that life had room in it at last for the thing she had set aside in a grey morning room years before. Daniel Marsh had waited, as a patient and self-respecting man waits, neither pressing her while she was another man's wife-in-law, nor pretending he did not care, and when the way was clear at last, when the empty bond to Frederick was quietly dissolved, he came to her not with grand speeches, but with the plain question of a man who knew exactly what she was worth. "I have helped you rebuild all of this," he said, "and I have loved you for the building of it. And I have nothing to offer a woman who needs nothing, except a man who will always ask you what you think and mean it when he hears the answer. I know it seems a small thing, but I have watched what its absence cost you, and I do not believe it is small at all." And Rowena, who had spent so many years unheard and so many more feared and deferred to, found that being simply and truly seen was the one luxury her fortune had never bought her, and she took his hand. They married quietly in the plain estate chapel, among tenants and masons, and one formidable old dowager Duchess who declared it the only wedding worth attending in 20 years, and Mrs. Egerton wept, which she denied to her dying day. And there was more real joy in that plain chapel than in all the cold grand rooms Hartwell had ever held. Daniel's own rank, when it came to him in time, added only a quiet irony to the tale. For the merchant's daughter, who had been told her worth lay in her husband's name, ended her life bearing a name she had built, and another she had earned by loving a good man, and cared by then for neither. And in the years that followed, when the estate stood as the finest in the north, and her children were old enough to ask about the old letters that had been struck from the gates, she would tell them the whole of it, not as a story of vengeance, for it had never been that, but as the one lesson she wished to leave them, that a name is not a possession but a debt, owed to everyone who bore it before and everyone who will bear it after, and worth exactly what its bearer builds, and not 1 penny more. That she had been told she was common, and plain, and nothing without a borrowed name, and had answered not with tears and not with fury, but with patience, and ledgers, and the slow, unglamorous work of building something true, until the day came that the borrowed name had to be struck out because it had become a lie, and her own put up in iron because it had become the truth. And she would tell them, last of all, the thing she had understood in a grey morning room on the day her cage was opened by the very man who thought he was locking her inside it, that a name given to you by someone who despises you can always be taken back, but a name you build with your own hands can never be struck from anything. That the people who are most certain of your weakness have simply never watched you when you had a reason to be strong, and that being written off as plain and dull and common is not the wound the world imagines it to be, but very nearly a gift. For no one troubles to guard against a woman they have already decided is nothing, and a woman underestimated for long enough is left free to become, quietly and entirely unopposed, exactly the thing her doubters would have moved heaven and earth to prevent, had they ever once thought her capable of it. That the years a careless man believes he has taken from you may prove, if you refuse to mourn them, to be the very years in which you become everything he was too blind to see you already were. and that the sweetest answer to a man who swears the name is his, and yours only by his leave, is not to argue and not to weep, but to go out quietly into the years, and build and build and build, until one summer evening his coach halts at a set of gates he thought he owned, and he reads, worked bright into the iron above his own bald head, the name of the house you made and the plain true words beneath it, and understands at last, too late, that it was built to last, unlike some. And you may stay inside, warm by your own fire, in the house you made, and let him read it as many times as he likes, and never once feel the need to go down to the gate, because the gate has already said, in iron, everything you will ever need to say to him.